You can share it out with anybody in your networks who you think might like this information. So again, welcome. My name is Jen Vanek. This is Setting the Stage for Successful Distance and Blended Learning Programs. This is the first of a three-part series, bringing forth key ideas from the IDEAL Consortium Handbook for Distance and Blended Learning, and we are pleased to have you here. Just for those of you who don't know, IDEAL Consortium is essentially a group of states who collaborate in support of quality distance learning through the facilitation of the EdTech Center at World Ed, and specifically me. So I provide a lot of technical support and professional development. We meet annually every August, and leaders who are involved in distance and blended learning and ABE from across the country get together and work together at the meeting in person, and then also work online with me in a community of practice in order to enhance their implementation. If you have any questions about IDEAL Consortium, you can find it easily on the World Ed website, or you can also email me here, jen_vanek@worlded.org. So today, what we're going to do today is just get a sense of who's in the room, and then really cover the first couple chapters of the handbook, which are around considerations for setting up or revamping distance and blended learning. Key to my approach within the handbook is to make sure that we have a shared language for talking about the work. So there are some definitions, there are some models, and then I'm going to give you some example studies for implementation in different states. So that is the work of the day. Throughout, because we are a very small group, I am just going to let this be fairly informal. And if you have a question, you can raise your hand, you can chat, let us know that you have a question, and you can even unmute yourself when called on, and we can, you can just talk and we can have a conversation. So Mike is going to pay attention to the chat and the hands up icon to let me know when people have questions. So the first thing I'd like to do is to get a sense of who's in the room. So we're going to give you a chance to practice using your chat right off the bat. If you could just chat which of these roles best describes the work that you do, that'll give me a sense of who's in the room and how to tailor my message. So you can expand chat in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and just let me know, are you a teacher, maybe staff, state staff? I would actually probably have a hard time choosing one when I was working in programs, but it looks like people are doing a pretty good job making a decision here. So we've got a few technology specialists, some program administrators, distance learning coach, instructional designer, professional developer. Okay, this is great. Very diverse group. It looks like everybody either has engagement as a classroom, directly in a classroom, or mediates instruction somehow. Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So the one last piece of housekeeping here, the three-part webinar series accompanies a three-part blog series, which has been running for about the last 6 weeks. Actually, the last of the 3 blog posts is going up tomorrow. I've shown the link here to the blog post that goes along with this webinar today. And Mike, if you could just find the actual link to that blog post and chat it so people can get to it more easily, that would be helpful. But at any rate, you can find it pretty easily on the World Ed website. So I encourage you, if you're intrigued by the conversation here today, to go to the website and check out the blog post too. All right, so we're talking about setting the stage for distance learning, and the title is quite intentional. The title suggests that you can't really just buy a license to an online curriculum, throw out some passwords and logins and hope and call that a distance learning program that's going to have much success. It's really important that your initiation or your revamping of a distance or blended learning program is based on some reflection, investigation of resources, and an experimental mode. So you really need to reflect first on the needs of your learners and the resources that you have available to them. And I would also say the goals of your program. And all of those things need to be aligned so that you're not either over-promising to learners or basically stretching beyond your capacity of your organization to do the work. So that means if you have some limited resources, define a bounded target that you're going to start using distance learning with. So choose maybe one class for blended learning, or choose one targeted subset, maybe like transitions learners for distance learning. But start small and reflect and make sure that that selection of your pilot aligns with the resources and the goals of your program more generally. And after you've kind of made those decisions, then you need to make sure that you understand the state policy in whichever state you're working, because that is going to help you decide some implementation guidelines for your own program and decide how you're going to be gathering data about your learners' use of whatever distance learning tools or online tools in a blended learning scenario. You're going to decide how you're going to track that stuff. But you must make sure that all of the decisions that you have align with state policy, which will be written to coincide and support the federal NRS policy. Your state leadership team should also be able to help you understand what those policies are. And as I recall, Massachusetts is in the midst of revising their state distance learning policy, so I am sure that you'll hear more from Luann Teller and Diane Satin, if you happen to be on the call from Massachusetts, when the new policy is released. Then finally, I'm suggesting an experimental mindset. And when I say experimental, I mean that teachers or programs maybe need a little bit more time or space to figure out how to implement a new model. So perhaps in the short term, you might have our goals or dedicated teacher support time for instruction, but you might need to relax a little bit, and you might need to throw resources at your distance or blended learning program at the beginning in order to make sure that your teachers in your program have a chance to really learn from initial limited or bounded implementation. I also think it's really important to be intentional about choosing a model. Choose an experimental pilot on blended or distance. Choose a targeted group of learners. Choose a core online curriculum, and then really pay attention to what's going on so that you can make adjustments midstream if you need to do that. So I'm going to pause right here just to see if anybody has any questions about this so far. And I know that Luann Teller is also on the call, so if anybody from Massachusetts has questions for Luann, feel free to ask them. Okay, so let's move into the definitions. So part of being reflective and choosing an experimental mindset is choosing a model. And to choose a model, we kind of need to know what we're talking about. So I'm going to be sharing some interesting and useful definitions for some of the terms that we use when we talk about this model of instruction. The first one is distance education. This definition actually comes from the NRS guidance document that you can see the link to here. There's a little picture of what it looks like. If you're looking online, this is where I got this. So essentially, at its basic, at its core, it's just distance ed is a formal learning activity where students and instructors are separated by geography, time, or both for a majority of the instructional period. The NRS guidelines say that for majority, that we're generally thinking 50%, like more than 50% of the time. So those learners are considered distance learners in policy. Distance learning materials are delivered through different types of media. It could be, old school, videotapes, if that's even a technology that's relevant anymore. But we sometimes default to thinking that distance learning is a digital technology. I'd argue that it should be so that we give our learners practice using digital technologies. But if you're living and working in a really rural community where that's a challenge, there are definitely other media that can be used to support distance learning. And the other aspect of this is that teachers support distance learners through multiple streams or channels of communication. Whatever seems to be relevant and match the time and the resources of the organization and the learners, but it could be a telephone call, email, or like a web conference. So this is the NRS definition of distance learning. This is basically, I would say, the rule of law and the model or the definition that all programs should align with when you're thinking about distance learning. Okay, any questions actually about this definition? Okay, then I'm going to move on. There is a very fascinating publication that came out in 2017. It's basically the most recent research in adult basic education on using online learning. Let me back up a second. There's a question from Leslie. How do you distinguish between distance learning or homework? That is generally a fuzzy distinction that is clarified through state policy. I'll tell you that in the state of Minnesota, homework is considered an extension of the learning that's happening in the classroom and does not include its own instructional element, its own original instructional element. So in Minnesota, if you read the Minnesota distance learning policy, it says that things that are counted for distance learning time need to have an instruction, a practice, and an assessment components, all three components, to be considered distance learning. The other thing that happens in some states is that there are certain online curricula that are reserved for distance learning time, and programs aren't allowed to use those in support of classroom instruction. So again, I guess I'll use Minnesota again as an example. I believe they're using Burlington English right now for their English language learners. And if that they have to use that either in a connection with a blended or a distance learning program. So I'm going to get to the definition of blended learning in a second. I think that's going to help. Okay, so as I was saying, Murphy et al. Offers some very interesting definitions to help us further clarify what this work means for us. Excuse me. The link. If you do a Google search on Murphy evaluating digital learning for adult basic skills, you'll be able to find this PDF. They essentially surveyed hundreds of learners in multiple states for over a year or so, and described what was happening with the use of different online tools. Some of them are tools that you will no doubt have recognized. And what they realized through their data collection, there were different models for use. And I'm just going to throw out these terms for you. Use them as they are useful, and perhaps even we could have some questions and discussion about this. So at its most general, there's this online learning term, which is just use of a product as a primary mechanism for instructional content. It's required, it was required, and the instructors provide some direct instruction in response to student needs that were identified in reports. So this is just at its most general, online learning. What is online learning? They also talk about supplemental learning, where these tools are scheduled for use outside of classroom, but the teachers don't require it, and the teachers might not even look at it. So this is what I would maybe consider homework, where the teachers don't really expect to look at it at all. There's no sort of programmatic time going into paying a teacher to support use of this, and it may or may not align specifically with what's happening in the classroom. So this is just supplemental learning. Then they talk about hybrid. And a hybrid model uses the product as a core instructional material in combination with teacher-led instruction in the class time. However, there's not a lot of interaction. So it might be work that the teacher assigns or lets a learner, like the teacher will let the learners know about a product. But the work that the students do in the online product isn't closely monitored, and the classroom instruction doesn't adjust in response to it. So for example, in Texas, there is a different way of thinking about a hybrid model where there might be a period of in-class instruction, like 2 or 3 weeks, and then the students don't come in for 2 or 3 weeks. They're just working online. The teachers don't really monitor it. It's just a way for them to stretch who they can serve. And then maybe the students would return for more in-class instruction later. So this hybrid learning can either be sort of stacked over time, or it can be offered in serial chunks. And then finally we get to blended learning, which I think is the gold standard that many programs are working toward. And that's this scenario where there is tight integration between online products, online learning, digital resources, into a broader curriculum and an instructional program. So instructors would be closely monitoring the work that students are doing online and then making adjustments to what happens in the classroom based on what they see online, and adjustments to what is happening online based on what they see in the classroom. So the difference here is that the learning is tightly integrated. There's one instructor who's aware of both going on and works to make sure that the learning in both modes can leverage each other. So these definitions all come from Murphy. I share them with you because, to my knowledge, they are the only research-based definitions of observed use of online tools in adult basic education classrooms. So if we're talking about research models, research-based models, I think they are quite useful. So I'd like to pause here to see if there are any questions. Sorry, I'd like to pause to see if there are any questions or comments from anybody here. Okay, so I think that I maybe I'm going to give some examples. I noticed there was a request for an example. You're going to see some examples about blended learning in just a second. Hybrid, I think I gave the example of Texas, and I'd actually like to just leave it at that right now because these are the two that might have implications for your NRS reporting. And the others don't really involve, supplemental learning doesn't really involve teacher support. It's just saying, hey, there's this thing called USA Learns. I encourage you to go out and try it out. But teachers wouldn't actually be looking at it. And then I would just have you consider the online learning definition is just like a blanket sort of overarching umbrella definition. But Zoe, thanks for the question. All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time here talking about blended learning because I think it is definitely the most complex, and there are, and I want to make sure we have the differentiation between blended and hybrid down. So if you are looking for more guidance on creating a blended learning program, I highly recommend going to the Christensen Institute.org. They have done a ton of research, mostly in K-12, some in post-secondary. Admittedly, adult basic education classrooms were not part of their research when they were coming up with these definitions, but I think they've done a lot more work in trying to clarify exactly what instruction looks like in a blended learning scenario. So the other thing that I want to say to you is that this is very useful because NRS policy does not actually go into blended learning at all. So it's nice to have this other body of research and guidance when you're trying to figure out what your program models would look like. So the Christensen Institute adds to our definition of blended, our definition of blended, that there's some student control over time, okay, the time that they're actually working, time of day when they're working, the place where they're doing the work, their learning paths, so actually making choices about what gets learned, and then how much they take on, how quickly they do this. At least part of it is supervised in an institution, and part of it is away from that institution at home. And that the modalities, this is similar to the previous definition, that the modalities along the learning path are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. So the model that you see here on the left is basically a list of the different models that the Christensen Institute has observed in classrooms. And I will get into each of these in turn in just a minute. But what I wanted you to notice is that there are carefully structured models, because I know that when you start to consider blended learning, it's really hard to imagine what it's going to look like. So starting with a model can help you at least make some early decisions about the work that you want to do. Backing up, I just want to reiterate before we move into these models, the difference between blended and distance is down here. Online work and blended and hybrid. Online work is not connected to in-class lessons and does not directly influence what instructors do in the classroom, per Murphy, at all. So everything that you're going to see next is not hybrid. It is definitely blended. These are the models of blended learning according to the Christensen Institute. The state of Arizona has done a wonderful job doing professional development to support programs in adopting one of these 7 models. Essentially, a few years ago, Arizona said, we are going to have blended learning in every single ABE program across the state. And the practitioners and the administrators in those programs are going to be able to describe which of these models they're using when they're talking about their work. So again, you can read more if you go to the Clayton Christensen Institute. And Mike, if you want to track down a link, that maybe just do a quick web search and throw a link into Clayton Christensen blended learning models, that'd be awesome. Essentially, we have some rotation models that are listed on the top. Basically, with rotation models, students cycle through different modalities of learning. So with station rotation, there's a classroom. It's almost all in class, but remember the Christensen models of blended learning require some of the work happening on the student's own time out of the classroom. But when they're in the classroom, there are these rotation there's stations set up with at least one station being online learning. So in this case, there's online learning that happens in the classroom that then gets extended out of the classroom. I can see this model being very useful if you have a program that has a lot of English language learners and you want to make sure you have opportunities for them to extend their learning outside of the classroom. So you could have maybe a station where there's some direct teacher-student small group instruction, maybe another station where there's some peer-to-peer work on maybe an ongoing project. And then the third station would be maybe a group of students working with a tutor on an online curriculum to make sure that the students have the digital literacy skills and navigation confidence so that then they can take whatever they're doing and continue using it outside of the classroom. So that's the station rotation model. This is the one that I've seen employed most frequently, actually this one and lab rotation, I've seen employed most frequently in Arizona. Lab rotation is basically just like station rotation, but that online learning part happens in a lab and not within the classroom itself. Flipped classrooms you have probably heard about. It's considered rotation. Basically, coursework and lectures happen at home, like maybe Khan Academy is the classic sort of flipped classroom learning resource, Khan Academy math videos are assigned for students to watch at home. And then in class, maybe they're doing some guided practice and or working collaboratively on projects. I've also seen in some ABE programs, teachers actually recording a short lecture, and students watch that at home, and then they come into the classroom and apply what they've learned by watching the lecture at home. Individual rotation I really haven't seen happen very much in adult basic ed because I think it requires a little bit more intense resources. This is basically a rotation where individuals kind of float. So if you imagine like an open classroom or an open school model where students have a lot of autonomy about choices that they're making, then that would be considered individual rotation. So I see a question from Nikki. I will try to answer it. Can you give an example of online learning program you have seen using the station rotation format? Yeah, well, there are several examples. There's something happening right now, a pilot that is just beginning in Maryland. There's a workplace ESL class that is happening in, it's an assembly, I think it's an assembly facility in Maryland. I've just been coaching the teachers there through setting up station rotation in their workplace ESL class. So in one corner of the workplace ESL class, they'll have sort of a conversation corner where the students are working on dialogues and vocabulary that they might need to use out on the work floor. So there's like a workplace specific station in the classroom. And then in another station, there's something that is a little bit more broad, like English language instruction or literacy instruction, topics that are not bound by the context of the workplace context, and students can work on that. And then in the third one, they're using an online curriculum to do some of their online work that they then extend and complete at home. And they are actually still using USA Learn. USA Learn is a free online curriculum that's available to anybody and actually has a teacher portal so you can monitor work. It's also mobile friendly if you do this weird workaround with adding a specific browser to your phone. But in that way, then the students, because it's mobile friendly, the students can continue their work outside the classroom easier because we know that many more people have access to mobile technologies outside of their work, school or work than actual computers and Wi-Fi. Just briefly, I'll highlight some of these other models. These other models actually for me get a little bit tricky because I think they kind of start to look a little bit the way distance learning is implemented in some programs across the country. So remember, these are just models. They're not like hard and fast bounded structures, but they're to inform you. So for example, the flex model, online learning is like really most of what the learner is doing, but the learner will come in to get support. The learners will come in to get support. So this is a cohort that might be working online together, meeting periodically to get some extra support. A la carte is an online course with a teacher of record in addition to other face-to-face classes. So this might be similar to what we would consider hybrid learning, where the classroom teacher doesn't necessarily monitor the online work, with a teacher of, but there's another teacher that's monitoring it. So this is sort of individuals this was not cohort-based, but it's basically individuals. And then enriched virtual I think this is essentially distance learning. Most of the coursework is completed online asynchronously, and a person, they come in periodically, very periodically for in-person work. So take these models, make use of them as they can help you inform the structures. I will say that there are excellent videos online if you are interested in actually seeing some of these things illustrated and demonstrated in practice in classroom. You can find videos for all of these things just on YouTube. very rich media resources in support of the Christensen blended learning models. So I want to just now pause and I mentioned that these models, they shouldn't be like a checklist that's structured. Like you can't just kind of throw a dart and say, oh, let's try this one. Basically, what you need to do is figure out what your program goals are, okay, what your resources are, like how many internet-enabled devices do you have actually on site, or what kind of physical space do you work in? What kind of what roles are available for teachers to play, and like the level of support that can be given? And like, do you have like a team of volunteers or technology specialists who can help support implementation? And then ultimately, how much control do you want your students to have? So you need to consider questions like this before you can decide on a model like this. If you don't have a computer lab, right? If you don't have a computer lab, obviously you can't do lab rotation. If you have very limited access to physical space, then maybe one of the models that relies more on students working independently and at home, like the Flex model, would work best for you. So if you can consider the answers to these questions, consider your overall programmatic goals, consider the resources that you have, then look at something like this and make some decisions about how you want to structure your work, then you have a much better chance of this succeeding. So I'm going to pause again to see if there are any more questions on these blended learning models and the questions. Also remember that in our experimental and reflective process that we're using, that I'm recommending, you definitely should be focusing on trying out one model at a time. So a typical pilot might be, oh, I'd like to try blended learning in one of my English language learning classrooms. And I know that these learners have access to devices, and I know that I want to integrate some math into their learning, so maybe I'll have them watch Khan Academy videos at home, and then when they come into the classroom, we can work through some of the language that they saw in the video, we can work through some of the math skills, and we can work on their numeracy in support of literacy within the academic language of mathematics. So you want to think really narrow when you're starting a blended learning program, and you want to make sure that your goals align with the resources that you have and your expertise available. So I'm going to share a couple examples of blended learning scenarios that I think have come out of the IDEAL Institute or IDEAL Consortium. One of them, the English Now Learning Circles in Rhode Island, you may have heard of. This is kind of a hybrid model, so it's not necessarily blended, but there is in-person support. I'm not sure exactly where this fits into the different categories, but essentially learning circles are opportunities for learners to come together and work in the same space at the same time on online learning platforms. RideFly is using them to support waitlists. But they're very structured. So the learners have a certain period of engagement, a certain number of hours a day. They have different things they can work on when they're coming to the learning circles. And essentially, anybody who has completed a cycle in a learning circle then has first dibs on an opening in a face-to-face classroom when something becomes available. So these small tables in the classroom would be grouped by topic area. So there might be some learners who are working on citizenship stuff. Well, in this one, they're all citizenship stuff. But if you go into their learning lounge generally, small pods of learners might be working on different content and supporting each other as they go. And then there is a teacher or a volunteer who's circulating to provide support for these learners. So I share this as a way to show you that we can think really flexibly about what blended and distance learning could look like. These learners could then go home and they could continue their work and be distance learners, coming in whenever they need to the learning circle after their cycle is complete. Another example that's very interesting to me is in Northwest Michigan. There was an adult basic education teacher working in an extremely rural area around Traverse City, Michigan, was having lots of trouble getting learners to drive in to participate in face-to-face classes. So she worked out partnership with the job centers, what we used to call one-stops in the area. There were seven one-stops in the area. She was able to create blended learning opportunities for people in the one-stops. There were way more one-stops than there were ABE programs. So she got a teacher to work in each of the one-stops to create blended learning and distance learning opportunities that were much closer to the students' homes, and then arguably really valuable because the learners were getting used to being in the one-stops, had access to job counselors, and were getting career development support on site when they were stopping in for the face-to-face component of their blended learning. This is a fascinating example. I just threw a screenshot of their website to show you some of the things they offer. They cover all of these things: diploma, GED test prep, ESL, just basic ABE work, basic computer skills, employability skills, transitions, and all of this is available to these learners who go into the American Job Centers in Michigan. Okay, any questions? So in both of the examples that I gave, you can see how the teachers and the program organizer, the program coordinators were thinking about the very real risk limitations and the affordances that they had available to them. So RIFLY knew that they had volunteers in libraries that could work to support people. They also knew that they had adequate technology. They had tablets they could give out. They actually loaned out tablets for this RIFLY project. And so they constructed their hybrid or blended scenario based on the resources and the constraints they had. The constraint, of course, was that these learners couldn't get into face-to-face classrooms. In Michigan, the constraint was learners couldn't drive very far to get to classrooms, so the affordance being the one-stop or the American Job Center being close. Having, these one-stops or American Job Centers have labs where the learners can go in and do the work. So each of these program coordinators thought very carefully about what was available to them and what the limitations were before they constructed the program. So that's on that very first slide when I said we need a thoughtful and experimental or reflective and experimental approach. This is the kind of thing I'm thinking about, these sort of like out-of-the-box implementations that can help you extend the number of adults that you're able to reach in your communities because you're thinking about delivery models that employ technology in order to help you reach more people or intensify the instruction for the people that you've got coming to you. So I'm just going to pause here for a little bit of reflection and sharing time. You've pretty much seen the content that I have to offer you today. So I'd like you to just reflect a little bit on thinking about these questions. So, why are you here, I guess, is the big question. I mean, you must be hoping to either start a distance or blended learning program or maybe revamp one, maybe just figure out if there's new research on what's going on. But what issue are you hoping to address with blended, hybrid, or distance ed? And have any of the models, either thinking from a higher level, of those Murphy definitions, or if you're thinking specifically about blended learning, have any of the models, do any of them initially strike you as being something you might want to explore? So I would love to actually have you talk, hear from one or two of you at least. We've got 15 minutes left in response to these questions. Hi, who's that? Somebody's trying to talk. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Leslie in Massachusetts.
Yeah, Leslie, I can hear you. Thank you for volunteering.
Great. Thank you. We tried a blended learning, or what we thought was blended learning model this year, and we did it program-wide, so it really spoke to me when you talked about trialing it with 1 or 2 classes at a time and being a little bit more deliberate. We tried it with, let's see, 10, 11 classes simultaneously. And we thought that we had set up a good structure, but we weren't truly doing blended learning. So the idea of a hybrid going forward for only a couple of classes is really helpful in planning. And thank you for sharing all of this information.
Great. So I think, yeah, hybrid, I think with blended learning, a resource that you really need to make sure you have available is teacher time. Blended learning takes more teacher time initially than just having your regular classroom instruction. I really believe that over time, teachers are just shifting where they're working in a blended model. Oh, go ahead and mute yourself if you want to, Leslie. But initially, it is probably going to take more time. So the hybrid, if you know that it's hard to spare up resources, you might want to start with a hybrid model first. Okay, anybody else? Okay, Luann, do you have anything that you want to add to the group before we move on?
Yeah, I was also trying to unmute myself. So the other question I would have for folks as they're thinking about this, since we are planning our professional development for next year, people who are in Massachusetts programs anyway. I know programs are in the process of developing their instructional plans for next year and their staffing. And I wonder if people could share what more information they might need, or what kind of professional development might best help you to move forward, or what kind of additional information might be helpful as you think about these options and try to make some decisions. So I'll put that out there.
So Leslie has responded that their part-time program had a structure for monitoring progress that could improve how teachers monitor and respond to the students' use of online tools. So some PD around that, I assume Leslie is asking for. And actually, I want you to know that the EdTech Center is developing a new course called Teaching Online, and we will definitely be zeroing in on that. But also, Leslie, know that the third webinar in this series is on that topic specifically. So maybe tune into that, and then look for the blog post that's coming out tomorrow, because the blog post tomorrow is on that topic too. Other programs, what in order to make these things a reality, are there other resources that you would need, or technical support or professional development? And what might those look like? Well, I think you know who to reach out to. Oh yeah, John, you are raising your hand. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm the distance learning teacher in our program at Berkshire Community College in Massachusetts, and I'd love to have some information, more information about alternatives to USA Learns. We're kind of investigating revamping our program, and I'm trying to come up with some alternatives. to USA Learns, even though USA Learns has the advantage of being free. I'm wondering if there are better options out there.
Well, I can respond initially, and then I think this is probably a longer conversation. But if the priority is free, then there aren't a ton of better options in the long term. But in the short term, through the end of August, you can get access to free mobile learning apps through the XPRIZE Communities competition. Mike, can you chat the page, the Team World Ed page? I don't know. I don't want to get into a ton of information about this now, but there was a basically social enterprise challenge to have app developers create a killer app to support adult literacy and adult ESL. And now we're in a phase of the competition where those apps are actually readily available and free to programs to support use of their learners if you join a team. So World Ed has a team. We have a nice webpage, which Mike has just chatted the link to, where you can see support videos about what the apps are, how to do onboarding of the apps, how to get learners going, and how to basically use them through the summer. Any of the apps are downloaded through the end of August are free to the learners who downloaded them for the rest of, for a whole another 12 months. 2 of the apps are only available on Android. 2 of the apps are available on both Android and iPhone. And I think 3 of the apps have learning management systems, so you can actually track. I won't give you the breakdown of those things right now. You can check. All that information is available on the Team World Ed XPRIZE page. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So that's short term. But it's an important thing for you to know about because the latest Pew research shows that 97% of adults in the U.S. have a phone, a mobile device, a mobile phone. All but 15% of those people have smartphones. So it's really critical, I think, that when you're choosing, if you're starting from scratch and you're looking for a new curriculum, that you choose something that is completely mobile friendly. If you don't, you run the risk of spending money on a licensed product that your learners won't be able to use unless you have a learning lab or a strong partnership with a library or another organization that has open computer labs. So really, really important to make sure that whatever you choose is mobile friendly. I'll just add then that there are a couple other tools that are out there. Voxy is a tool that has English language learning that's embedded within a lot of career-specific curricula. So if you're looking for more of an adult career pathways approach, you can look at Voxy. Burlington English is an enormous online learning curriculum that actually has a lot of blended learning support built into it. So it will give guidance to teachers on what to do in the classroom and what to do online. I've heard some states who have taken that on as their state curriculum have had teachers who absolutely love it. I will tell you that blended learning is really, really big. So if you do choose blended learning, you're going to need dedicated staff time for exploring it and figuring out how to make use of all the affordances of Burlington English. So those are just some options. I'm going to now, Mike, actually, could you chat the link to Workforce EdTech? Thank you. So we've got links to other things. The Workforce EdTech is a repository. It's a project that the EdTech Center at World Ed led. And basically we have vetted a bunch of online learning curricula that we have included there. And we've also provided you in Workforce EdTech with rubrics and criteria for you to use to evaluate your own learning management systems or online curricula. So I encourage you to check out that website too as a place to get some ideas about different learning materials. Okay, Any other questions? Thank you, John. That was a great question. Okay, since there are no other questions, I would like to just remind you that we have 2 more webinars. These are Eastern time zone times here, 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern time zone on June 5th and June 19th. On June 5th, we're going to talk about the recruitment, screening, and orientation process that's really critical in order to support long-term persistence. Getting learners set up properly has been shown to have a huge impact on their long-term persistence. There is a blog post on this already on the EdTech Center Tech Tips blog. And so I encourage you to check out that blog post. If you want to hear more about this, come to the webinar on June 5th. Our final webinar in this series that aligns with the piece that's being published tomorrow is about assessment and instruction in distance and blended learning programs. And so, again, I encourage you to check it out on the blog, and then also come to the webinar. Yes, all these webinars are recorded. If you register for the webinar, even if you know you can't be here, if you register for the webinar, you will get the recording. Mike has chatted the link to the second webinar registration. There was also a question about chatting the links to those mobile apps. John, if you go to the Team World Ed website that Mike chatted just a little bit earlier, you will find the links and descriptions of all of those. You'll find all the information you need, including links to those learning resources. I'll just tell you, they're called Cell Ed, Learning Upgrade, Codex. It's a quest for lost words. It's a quest game. And then the last one is Amrati. It's a reading app called Amrati. But check out the Team World Ed website, and you'll find links to all of them. Okay, any final questions? Okay, well, I thank you all for being here, for sharing some of your questions and observations. And know that I am available if you have any follow-up questions. I'm just going to chat my email address here so that you can access it easily if you have any follow-up questions for me. It's been a pleasure spending this hour with you, and I hope you all have an excellent day. Thanks for coming.